Good morning. This is a special week at Ashville Road, VBS week, or to be more exact, VVBS, Virtual Vacation Bible School. And I'm sure when Tim gets up, he's going to say a few things about this, but obviously this year, this is an experimental VBS. We're doing it a new way. We're adjusting to the situation and hope that our kids will have a lot of fun and learn a lot about God this week. So if you're in that age group that will enjoy that this week, make sure that you have one of the packets in the back. And let me tell all of you, if you're not in the age group, you can still tune in and watch all the fun and activities online in the various ways. And Tim will explain all of that in a few moments. Let me get to our subject for this morning. It's a question. Are you offended? And our text comes from Isaiah chapter 53. I would say the best known prophecy of the sufferings of Christ that we can find in the Old Testament. There are certainly others that predicted His crucifixion, but this one is the best known. This is the one that you'll hear the most prior to the Lord's Supper, the reading that you'll hear the most from the Old Testament. Isaiah really doesn't get to the suffering, though, until you come to verses 7 through 9. And even then, he doesn't spend a great deal of time on the physical agony of Jesus in those verses, just referring to it once, really, explicitly in verse 9 with regard to His death. Now, the actual word that he uses is death in the plural, to His deaths, emphasizing the comprehensive nature of His suffering and how cruel and hard it really was. But what he spends most of the time on in verses 7 through 9 is not the physical agony, but the character or the nature of the suffering and how it was different in that it was so unjust, that it was so wrong. Now, two people can suffer the same physical agony, and in terms of degree, one case could be worse than the other. I can give you an example from 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 15 through 16, where the Apostle Peter says, "But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief, or an evildoer, or a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but in that name let him glorify God." And Peter's setting forth two cases. One who suffers because he deserves it, and one who suffers and doesn't deserve it. And it is an accepted societal norm that the case of the person who suffers unjustly is worse than the case of the person who suffers justly. Now, if that's the case, then Jesus, according to Isaiah 53 and the gospel accounts, suffered the worst miscarriage of justice in the history of the world. And in that, He suffered worse than any human being has ever suffered, not just in terms of His physical agony, but also in terms of the fact that He was the only innocent man who ever lived, and He was punished unjustly. Now that brings us to this question. Are you offended? We've seen a lot these days about injustice. And I want to be very careful here, and I want to be very clear. Things like racism and inequity and poverty and crime and government oppression are wrong, and we should stand against them. But we're challenged by this passage as we think about how should we respond to the injustice. And our question shouldn't be, can I respond in any way that I feel like, but rather, how did Christ respond to injustice? Or in other words, what is the unique Christian response based on Jesus to injustice? And I'll warn you this morning that you're probably not going to feel very comfortable with the answer, because the answer is countercultural. It even cuts against the grain of human nature to do what we see Christ doing in the face of injustice and to follow after the example that He sets for us. And so we're going to look at it, and if you'll stick with me to the end of the lesson, I promise you that you'll learn two things. First, that Jesus' response to injustice is countercultural and very different from any other response that the world may offer you. And the second thing that you'll find is this, that it's the most powerful way to change things for the better. So let's look at it. And the first thing we're going to note is the injustice itself. As we examine these passages, these three verses in Isaiah 53, verses 7, 8, and 9, you're going to find a picture of injustice. Here's how it starts in verse 7. He was oppressed, Isaiah says, and He was afflicted. He was oppressed. The word there means He was treated unsparingly. Roman soldiers had diamond-hard hearts. They were specialists in human torture. They knew the human body and had studied it to learn how to inflict as much pain as possible. And that's how you get crucifixion. What did they do to Jesus? Well, a preliminary to every crucifixion was a beating called a scourging. They would use a scourge, which was a weapon like a whip. It was a whip with several leather thongs, at the ends of which were attached sharp bits of sheep bone and iron balls. And the bones were there to cut the back of the victim, and the balls were to bruise the back, so that when they got done, there was almost nothing left to the person's back that they'd been beating. That was the preliminary. They would bring him within an inch of his death, and then they would nail him through his hands, through his feet, to a cross. And they would erect the cross and raise it up high with the victim on it and drop it heavily down into the hole that was made for it, so that the nails would tear at his hands and at his feet. And then he would hang there, suffocating, struggling for every breath. When you're hanging in that position of crucifixion, as you're hanging, you can't exhale your breath. You have to pull up to exhale breath, and then you have to lower yourself down to inhale. And so you writhe up and down, fighting for every breath. And in most cases, mercifully not in the Lord's case, but in most cases, crucifixion took several days to take the life of the victim. In Jesus, it was just a few hours. Finally and mercifully, He succumbed to death. But He was truly oppressed. The word means treated unsparingly. They spared nothing as He was mocked, ridiculed, and tortured. Isaiah says He was oppressed and He was afflicted. Now, the word there literally means He suffered Himself to be afflicted, which suggests voluntarily offered up Himself. And in the gospel, we see that more plainly as He tells His disciples in John 10, 17, and 18, that no one was taking His life from Him. He was laying down His life of His own accord. Jesus could have summoned legions of angels to save Him from the cross, but instead He suffered. He chose to suffer for you and for me. And so He was afflicted in that way. We get to verse 8, Isaiah says more. By oppression and judgment, he says, He was taken away. Those two words in combination, oppression and judgment, means by an oppressive judgment sentence. In other words, He was sentenced to death by the official judicial authorities. Jesus underwent 6 trials total, 3 Jewish and 3 Roman. All of them presided over by authorized governing bodies. And yet, the irony was, these systems that God put on earth to exact justice were creating the worst injustice the world had ever witnessed. It was an oppression, and it was a judgment, and it created injustice. Verse 9, Isaiah says, "And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death." The first part of that verse represents the intention of the Jews and Romans to have him buried with the wicked. They crucified him as a common criminal and intended for his body either to be left on the cross or to be thrown into a mass grave with other criminals. But the last part of the verse tells us what really happened and describes the compassionate action of Joseph of Arimathea. He was the rich man who requested the body of Jesus from Pilate, and when he received it, he took it and he placed it in his own tomb so that it could be treated with respect. How Isaiah knew all of this can only be explained by inspiration. Verse 9 finishes saying this, "Although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth." In other words, he did not deserve this. Peter elaborates on this in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 22 and 23. Peter obviously was thinking about Isaiah 53 and these verses we're looking at this morning when he wrote these words. Listen to what he says here. He says, "He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth." It's almost an exact quotation of Isaiah 53. He says, "When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly." And so the world crucified the only innocent man who ever lived and treated him as a common criminal. What a picture of injustice that we find here in Isaiah 53. We get a picture of the worst miscarriage of justice ever suffered. Now, this year we've seen a lot of injustice. Our eyes have been opened, right? We've seen it on the news. We've witnessed it. It's all we talk about. There are protests. There are marches in the street. People are saying, we're not going to take this anymore. And all of these injustices that have been highlighted are indeed very terrible. But friends, if you're thinking this year is different from any other, you haven't had your eyes open. For all of human history, we have been doing terrible things to one another. That's nothing new. With Christ, there was something different. Because Jesus didn't deserve it. Now, all of us, we've sinned and deserve some degree of punishment, although we may not deserve what we get. That's how we could describe the injustices created against us. We deserve some punishment, just maybe not the degree of punishment that we get. With Christ, we have to say this: He deserved no punishment. He was completely innocent. He had never done anything wrong in His short adult life. And yet He was treated as the worst of criminals, crucified on the cross. And that's the picture of injustice that we're dealing with as we look at Isaiah 53. Now let's turn from the injustice now to see how Jesus responded to it. What was the response to injustice? And that brings us back to verse 7. I skipped over the last part of verse 7. Let's go back to it and see how Jesus responded. Yet He opened not His mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so He opened not His mouth. This imagery of a lamb or a sheep flows from verse 6, where we're described as straying sheep. Isaiah says, all we like sheep have gone astray and turned everyone to his own way. And Christ is a contrast. He's the sheep that didn't stray away. He's the sheep that faced the slaughter. And what is he doing as he goes to the slaughter? Is he crying out in protest, in bitterness, in retaliation, fighting to save his life? No. He opened not his mouth. He didn't say a word. Now, when you go over to the Gospels, the officials in charge of his death get very frustrated about this. They're trying to have a trial, and a man is accused of a capital crime, and he won't defend himself. Pilate is saying things like, why won't you speak? Don't you know that I have the authority to release you? And he doesn't say anything. And the high priest gets so frustrated, he orders an official to slap Jesus in the face for not defending himself. They've never seen anything like this before. He doesn't open his mouth. He won't defend himself. He refused to play the victim. You see, that's the thing about bullying. You can't have a bully without a victim. That doesn't mean the abuse didn't hurt. He didn't give his suffering to the bullies to empower them. He wouldn't allow his suffering to empower the bullies. He didn't give them a victim. How different is that from the way we handle our offenses? On a grand scale or just in everyday life? What do? It's totally opposite of what we see here. We complain, we blame, we carry bitterness, we get angry, we resent, we pity ourselves. And we give in to this anger and this bitterness and resentment because that's what everybody else does. Jesus did the one thing no one else does. He kept his mouth shut. He didn't play the victim. He didn't wallow in self-pity. Have you ever seen anything like that before? Had anyone before him ever considered doing anything like that? A lamb silent before his shearers. This image of a lamb, the word here has to do with a 1-year-old lamb without blemish. Of course, it has to do with a sacrificial lamb. And in the New Testament, it's used exclusively to describe Jesus as the sacrificial lamb. Remember John the Baptist in John chapter 1. He's standing with his disciples, and Jesus passes by. And what does he say? He says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." You know what he's doing? He's getting them to look back at Isaiah 53. He uses the word that in the Greek translation of the Old Testament is used here to describe the silent lamb. It's the lamb silent before its shearers, the lamb led to slaughter, the lamb volunteering for slaughter. Now, we see this and we're faced with an interpretive problem. Jesus is presented as an example of how to behave when facing injustice. And so we see this, and what does he do? He's quiet. He doesn't protest. He doesn't scream. He doesn't stomp his feet in anger. Does that mean justice doesn't matter? Does that mean we can't fight wickedness and injustice in this world? Does this mean we should say nothing about it? Well, to answer that question, let's go in the third place, to the purpose of suffering injustice. And when we see why Jesus did what he did, we'll understand the power behind the way that he responded to the injustice. Again, I've skipped over this to save it for the end. But Isaiah is doing something really amazing here as an Old Testament prophet prophesying 750 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. He's predicting something known as substitutionary atonement. And it really goes back to verses 5 and 6, which we haven't been talking about, but we'll go to it here, where it says, He was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon Him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with His stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on Him the iniquity of us all. In verse 8, which we've read, it says that He was stricken for the transgression of my people. See the substitution? He was innocent. We're guilty. He died. We lived. He died in our place. And this is precisely the interpretation Peter gives to this passage in 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter 2 verse 24. Listen to how he remarks on it. He Himself bore our sins in His body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By His wounds you have been healed. Now the name for that is Substitutionary Atonement. Basically all it means is very simple. It's what you've heard about the gospel your whole life. You sinned. You deserve death. The wages of sin is death. Jesus was innocent, but He died in your place so that you can live. That's all it means. He died in your place. He died the death that you deserved. And so it was the worst miscarriage of justice in the history of the world, but it wasn't senseless. You see, it had meaning, it had a purpose, and the purpose was to save you. Okay, that's fine for Him, somebody might say, but what about me? Well, are you still looking at 1 Peter chapter 2? Let's let Peter interpret this for us. And what does Peter say in verse 21? This is what he says. He left you an example so that you might follow in His steps. So that you might follow in His steps. I understand why Jesus died the way that He died. He had to step in or mankind would be utterly lost. But why do I have to suffer injustice? Why do I have to keep my mouth shut? Why can't I give in to the bitterness? Why can't I resent it? Why can't I retaliate? Why can't I be angry? Why can't I play the victim? Why can't I wallow in self-pity? And the answer is this. You have a job to do as well. And the salvation of the world is at stake, and it rests on your shoulders too. Because when you respond to injustice the way Jesus does, you are walking testimony to the hope for all sinners. You're showing the world another way. You're breaking the cycle of anger and bitterness. Because what we normally do is He hurts me, I hurt him, he defends himself by hurting me back, and the cycle goes on and on and on. But when we respond the way Jesus does, as a lamb silent before its shearers, as a sheep going to the slaughter without opening his mouth, there's no defense in return. The cycle is broken. We testify to hope instead of anger and death. Does that mean I can't speak out against injustice? Does that mean we never say anything? We don't protest that it's wrong to preach against wickedness? Not necessarily. But we need to ask these questions. Before you speak out against some injustice, whether it's personal or global, whether it's something in society or something in your life, there are 4 questions you should ask. First of all, is it true? Have I studied the facts? Am I even right about this stance that I am taking? Maybe I don't know enough and I need to shut my mouth for a little while and listen. Secondly, is it the right time? You can say the right thing at the wrong time and do a lot of damage. What does the proverb say about a word fitly spoken? Proverbs 25, verse 11. Always speak fittingly, meaning when it's the right season for it. Thirdly, have I earned the right to speak? Is it even my say? If I speak on the subject, will people even listen to what I am saying? Or have I behaved in such a way in the past that have canceled my ability to speak on this issue? Will people perceive me as a hypocrite, or am I maybe in actuality a hypocrite? Have I removed the log, as Jesus put it, out of my eye so that I can take the speck out of my brother's eye? Am I the one to say it? Have I earned the right? And then finally, and this is the one I want to park on for a moment here, what's my motive? Why do I want to demand justice for my neighbor? And this gets to the point of Isaiah 53 and the point of the gospel overall. What's the motive? After Christ, when we look at the behavior of His disciples, we struggle to find an example of anger, of bitter protests. They preached against wickedness and injustice, but they did it in love. And when they were subjected to oppression, they didn't play the victim, but they rejoiced in their suffering. Now, why is that? It's because they chose a route other than anger, bitterness, resentment, and self-pity. You see, what they decided to do was follow in their master's steps and respond in love. Because if you do not destroy the evil inside of you, it will destroy you. And whenever you deal with that evil inside of you, then you're able to speak for justice from a much stronger position than that of anger and bitterness. So what do? B.B. Warfield did a study on the emotions of Christ. And what he did, it was a word study, and he looked at every word in the Gospels describing the feelings or the emotions of Christ. And he found that the word used most often for the emotions of Christ was a word translated compassion. In modern translations, the King James Version uses the word pity. But it's compassion. And literally it means to give your heart to someone, to hold out your heart to another person. That's an expression we'll use. He gave his heart to that person. What does that mean? It means you identify with the other person, with the person who wronged you. You seek to understand that person rather than caricature them. See, that's what we often do, is we reduce a person down to their ugliest trait and blow that up and make them a one-dimensional cartoon character that's just that one thing. Somebody might say to you, well, why don't you ever talk to that person anymore? Well, he's just a liar. He's just a liar. I notice that you're not friends with her anymore. She's just a gossip. That's all she is. See, that's why we keep the hate going. That's how we keep the anger going. We reduce them down to that one thing that wronged us, and we make them not complicated. And we excuse ourselves because it's complicated, right? We're more than just the lie. We had struggles or challenges or reasons or moments of weakness. It's not who we really are, but they did it. That's all they are. That's not compassion. That's not pity. That's not what Christ did. Christ would identify with them and realize they're a complicated person. And that's what you have to do for forgiveness to take place. The Yugoslavian writer Miroslav Volf said this: "Forgiveness flounders because I exclude the enemy from the community of humans, even as I exclude myself from the community of sinners." I don't forgive because I exclude my enemy from the community of humans. He's just a liar. She's just a gossip. As I exclude myself from the community of sinners. Well, you don't understand what I was going through. I had challenges. You would have done the same thing if you'd been in my shoes. That's what we do. But that's not what Jesus did. He held out His heart to the people who oppressed Him. And He saw them for who they were, complicated human beings. And He believed there was good in every person. And so He could forgive them. Until we come to understand that forgiveness like that is essential to Christianity, we haven't become the people Christ wants us to be. Is forgiveness an option? I think we all know that it's not. After the model prayer in Matthew 6:14 and 15, Jesus said, if you forgive your neighbor his trespasses, your Father who is in heaven will forgive your trespasses. But if you forgive not others their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. That's a condition. No forgiveness for you if you don't forgive others. And it's plain as day. Why do we have so much trouble seeing it? Is it possible that we're more influenced by our culture of anger and bitterness than we are by the Word of God? Is it possible we're more influenced by the people around us than the one who is in us? We've got to take a look at that. We may not like what we're seeing here because we're offended. We all have reasons to be offended. There are a lot of insults in society. What will we do? We start spinning in the cycle of anger and bitterness and resentment? Or will we break the cycle with love? Have compassion? Is it possible that we could be powerful enough to do what Jesus did? After suffering the worst miscarriage of justice in the history of the world, hanging on the cross and saying the words, the most powerful words ever spoken, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. We have a choice, and we have plenty of opportunities to practice this. Will we speak against wickedness and injustice from love or from hate? That's the question before us. Because Jesus chose love, you have hope this morning. This very hour, it's one of the reasons we're assembled here together, is to help you. Are you ready to obey the gospel and become a child of God? Are you ready to make the decision Kinley made last week to follow Christ for the rest of your life? Step out of the cycle of hate. Speak from love. Have you done that, yet fallen back into culture's ways? Have compassion. Come back to God. Get out of the cycle of anger and hate and walk with Jesus. If we can help you in any way, we ask you to come. We sing.